Morning, dear friends. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Today we are studying, like every day, the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Presently, Maseches Shabbos, chapter 19, 132b. I should have mentioned previous or before that today is the 6th of Elul, Vav Elul, September 2nd. Believe it or not. We missed Rosh Chodesh. Yesterday was Rosh Chodesh September. Today is the 2nd of September. And again, we're studying the entire Talmud, and there's no better way to prepare for Rosh Hashanah than to dip our minds and hearts into the Talmud, into Torah, and in such a wonderful Chabura. So thank you all for being here. Let's share the screen and let's get started. As I mentioned before the recording, we're going to find today's Gemara somewhat familiar, because it's going to be a different discussion, but a similar format, a similar style, and so we'll start feeling like we have a familiarity with this format. And so let's take a look. I don't know why. Did we lose the choice to? Let me try this. Sorry, folks. Hang on. No, I don't want to sign up. I want to log in. It's weird. I don't know why it's not allowing me to change the format. All right. Well, anyways, yesterday we read a brisa that was to support and be familiar or consistent with Rabbi Yochanan's assertion that the way we know a bris is done on Shabbos is because it says by Yom Hashmini. The emphasis is on the word by Yom. The brisa, the author of the brisa, kind of walks us through his way of thinking. And initially, it is obvious to him that, or I should say, at a first glance, the Tana made a case that it should be evident from the word Yimel B'sar Lasai, Mishmina Yimel B'sar Lasai. From that itself, we should already know that the bris is done even on Shabbos. Even though there's another pasuk that says not to desecrate Shabbos, it would be with the exception of circumcision. But then in that very brisa, the Tana says, you know what? Actually, I don't know. Maybe Shabbos pushes aside bris. Talmud Laimar, and that's why I need an extra word by Yom to back us up, to shore up the case that bris is done even on Shabbos, even though otherwise the activities that bris circumcision entails are not to be done on Shabbos. Our Gemara yesterday set out to understand the thought process of the Tana, the thought process in the Brisa. And doing so, it explained to us how there are two different logical methods of analyzing the different mitzvot in contention, and either come to a conclusion based on a Kal V'chomer that Shabbos is more powerful than bris, than Milah, but you can also come to the conclusion that Milah is more powerful than Shabbos. All things being equal, we don't know. Therefore, we need an extra word in the Torah. I explained this lining up of different mitzvot to see which one is stronger than the other, which pushes the other aside, as a type of maybe a bracket kind of competition to see who edges out the other. And so we have different mitzvahs, and we came to consider that it's likely that bris is stronger than Shabbos because of its relationship to because of the fact that bris pushes away saras, etc. That was the conversation that we had yesterday. Today we're going to explore the assertion that Milah doichet saras, that circumcision pushes aside saras. And so as we go into this, I just want to remind ourselves, and Alan asked an interesting question. Is not saras a reflection of a spiritual deficiency? And if that's the case, what would it help to remove the saras? You'll get it again. I think that was the way you worded it. And so, in other words, I think what you're saying is, if you're supposed to have saras, stick with the saras. If you're not supposed to have saras, you wouldn't have saras anyways. So I just want to answer, although you're not going to like this answer so much. Right now, we are not concerned so much about the spiritual message or the purpose behind saras. We're asking in a sense, a cut and dry halachic question. maybe you will get saras again. But at this very moment, are we allowed to remove it? Generally, you're not allowed to remove saras. Granted, if you manipulate the system, Hashem has a way to deliver you saras again. This is fair and true, or possibly true. But right now, we're asking a very technical question. Today, you're a moel, you're a rabbi, and your congregant says, listen, we got to do a bris, but there's saras or potential saras. What do we do? What do? We go ahead with the bris at the risk, or even though we are eliminating the leprosy. It's not really leprosy, the saras, skin malady, even though otherwise you're not allowed to cut off evidence of saras. That is the halacha. That is the question, and that would be the frustrating but simple basic answer. I'm not saying we're not going to have deeper conversations about the mystical dimension of it, but as far as just before going into the Gemara, I wanted to answer your question because I thought it was good, and I'm sure others were thinking about
Rabbi,
it. Yes, Rabbi.
Isn't there another problem? The moil coming in contact with saras?
If saras was leprosy, yes. But the way we understand saras to not really be leprosy, but another kind of skin deformity, it does not appear that saras was infectious. Now, I know you'll tell me then why do people go into quarantine? But I'll answer that that's a modern definition that we used to call it quarantine. It was really an isolation that had to do more with a punishment or the impurity that did not allow him to convey ritual impurity, but it is not necessarily infectious, and or they didn't know that it was infectious, if you want to say it was infectious. And so although that is something that's interesting, I don't believe that was a halachic concern or consideration. Or maybe we're talking about an adult who comes to realize that he needs to circumcise himself and he's going to do it to himself. Now, I don't know if that's a great idea for a person to self-circumcise, although I think it says that Avraham Avinu did. But generally speaking, that's probably not a great idea. Probably better to have someone else assist. But we'll leave it at that. Dr. Hammer, you look uncomfortable with my.
I am uncomfortable with that concept. Yeah, I'm just my glasses fogged up. I started to question something. Yes.
Anyways, no, I was just trying to troubleshoot Pastor Barrel's question. All right, so let's see it inside. And again, as I said, I think this will be the formula, the style, the outline will be familiar. Tana Rabbanan, quoting a brisa that we were taught, our sages taught in a brisa. Mila doicha es hatzaras. Circumcision will push aside leprosy. Again, I don't really like translating it as leprosy. It's not in modern Ivrit, I suppose, saras is leprosy. But the common understanding is that saras is a spiritual skin malady, skin deformation that is not necessarily anything to do with saras. I actually have a sefer at home that maybe one day I'll bring to shul, where the author claims that he did a lot of research in the dermatological world, and he has other skin maladies which he supposes are actually what the biblical saras is. Take it or leave it. But anyways, mila doicha saras, bein bismana, bein shaloi bismana. So whether the baby is 8 days old and they have saras. And Alan, you asked another question. How could a baby get saras if they didn't warrant it? But that's a question that assumes that halacha is concerned about the baby got it. Why? I don't know. But let's say the baby got it. That is the halachic question. So the answer, bein bismana, whether the bris is on the 8th day and the baby has saras, bein shaloi bismana, or maybe we're talking about an adult. Rashi's going to have a different take on this. Whatever the point is, whether it's on time or not, meaning you might say, look, we already pushed aside the bris, so wait a little longer, let the person heal from saras. No, you go straight ahead and do the bris. Yom Tov, what if there is a conflict between Chag and doing the bris? So we've been talking until now about doing Shabbos. What about Chag? It's Yontif. Does Yontif push aside the bris? Will we have a Rosh Hashanah bris if there's a baby born 8 days before Rosh Hashanah? So here's the answer. Yom Tov einei doicha ela bismana bilvad. Only a timely 8-day-old bris, or bris on the 8th day, then it'll push aside Yontif, but otherwise you wait till after Yontif. Now let me show you Rashi, and I'll show you why what I said here may have been a little incorrect. At least Rashi would disagree with my explanation. bris bein shaloi bezmana. What's the instance? Kegoin katan chayla. For example, a young child who's not well. The imtinu loy ad sheyavri, and then we had to anyways wait for him to heal. So for whatever reason, Rashi doesn't like my scenario of the Baal Teshuvah who didn't know about bris. Rashi would rather say we're talking about a situation where there's a youngster, but the Moil says let's defer, let's push off the bris. And now it's a month later, and it's time to do the bris. The child's better, Baruch Hashem, but they've developed this possible saras. Now the question is, do we go ahead and do the bris, or do we wait for the saras to heal? And the answer is Milo doiches atzaras bein bizmana bein shalei bizmana. No matter the situation, whether it's on time or not, we push aside the tzaras. We do the bris.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I think I read that there was a very famous bris done on Rosh Chodesh, January, a couple of thousand years ago.
I don't know how famous it was at the time. I think it became more exciting a few hundred years later. So I don't know. And certainly not in the Jewish people weren't that into it.
No, but the kid was born in the manger.
Jewish people usually had to hide
in the manger. He was born in the manger, and they made him. I don't know if they had bagels, but it was on January 1st. It was one on the 25th, and they December. And anyway, okay, we won't go there.
But that's before Matan Torah.
Jews typically would hide. Jews would typically hide on that day. By the way, they would hide out. They'd be afraid to be out in public there. And anyway, okay. More Pesach, but anyways, okay. So now so right now all we have are the facts. The halachic facts are that a bris, timely or not, will push aside, will cut off that if the leprosy, even though usually you're not allowed to cut off leprosy. That is the halacha, cut and dry halacha. Now we're going to get into the analysis. Minohani, how do I know? Give me a proof, give me a source for the fact that bris overpowers, bris takes precedent over the commandment not to remove leprosy from your skin. So now we're going to give a similar, familiar layout. And here's the brayso that talks about this. Yimol bisar arlato. The Torah says, circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, remove the foreskin, do a bris. The apal pisha yesham baheres. Is there maybe a beheres? Is there a white spot that might be saras? I don't care. Yakoitz, remove it, cut off the foreskin. Do a bris. Uma ani mekayim. But hold on a second. There is a biblical commandment. Hishomer b'negat saras. Be very careful. Guard a possible spot of saras. Don't remove it. Our answers, Bishar Mekaimais Chutz Mimila. This is talking about any place aside for bris. Yes?
I think we have to refine it a little bit because it's actually not, if you want to think about it, you're not really removing the tzarat, you're removing the ola. It just so happens that the tzarat is on the ola. But
okay.
in reality, you're removing the ola, not necessarily specifically the tzarat.
In the eyes of our Gemara, however, we have not distinguished between only moving the arla or cutting off additional tissue. That doesn't seem to be in the eyes of halacha. In the eyes of halacha, it's haynuhach. It seems to be, but you're making a good point. You're doing the mitzvah, and only along the way, the tsaras spot or the potential tsaras is being removed. That's an important point. But I don't think the halachic, the brayso is not making such a differentiation. But it's good to, I guess I don't want to use the word visualize, but it's good to conceptualize and understand what's going on. Maybe it's different than a typical dermatologist cutting off a leprous patch.
Rabbi, it's also possible that the tsaras went right through and is on the penis itself.
Yeah, I hear you, but then it wouldn't help, I guess. So, all right, let's.
So you're not really cutting it off.
But then you wouldn't. Yeah. All right. Let's see how the Gemara generally. Well, yeah. All right. Let's see the Gemara. So we have two conflicting texts. Yimol b'sar lasai, do that circumcision. And we have Yishomer b'neged tzaras. Don't get rid of your tzaras. Initially, we say, okay, Yishomer b'neged tzaras, that would be any time except for if there is an arla underneath the tzaras. Which word, by the way, by Bris is emphasizing that you should even cut off if there's a spot of leprosy. So Rashi tells us, Basar ribayhu v'ladrasha. The word yimal bisar arlasai, remove the flesh of the foreskin. That word bisar is really superfluous. You know why? If the Torah would say yimal arlasai, circumcise the foreskin, we would already know exactly what we're talking about. The word basar is extra, and extra words are never extra. Extra words are there to teach us an additional halacha. And so Rashi right away tells us, how do I know that you plow through, you do the bris, even if there's an impediment, even if there's a potential halachic roadblock, bisar or loss, bisar, particularly basar. That's what Rashi, that's the case Rashi. So again, let's refresh. We want to probe, we want to explore why it is that you will push aside and not be concerned about a prohibition of leprosy and go ahead with the bris. So the Brisa initially introduces us to these two conflicting psukim, and the initial way of reading it is Yimov Sarlasai, you go ahead and you do the bris no matter what, even though Yishomer b'neged tzaras seems to say no, it's not talking about a case of Mila. That's the initial Hava Amina. That's the initial way of reading the story. But now our author of the Brisa conveys his insecurity. He's not certain. Maybe not. Maybe this restriction does extend to even block us from doing a bris. Again, maybe this first explanation, this first way of understanding it is incorrect. Maybe afilu mila, even bris cannot be done. Hold on, doesn't the Torah say you gotta cut off the foreskin? Maybe there's one exception. Bizman she'ein ba baheres, so long as there is no baheres. Talmud loymar basar, afal pi sheyesham baheres. Therefore, the Torah adds. Hold on, give me one second. Allow me to. Give me 1 second. I think I made a mistake. It's a good mistake, but it's a mistake nonetheless. I read for you Rashi over here because that's how the Sefaria links them. But I think this Rashi really belongs to the next Gemara. So nothing really changes except that what I said over here, that it's the Yimel Basar Lasai, that was actually needed to be over here. So over here, initially he says, yeah, two psukim, but obviously you got to go ahead with it. Maybe even circumcision is pushed aside. So therefore, the Torah adds the word basar. The word basar is extra to tell us it's an emphasis to say, even in a case where you feel hesitant, maybe there's a halachic conflict. No, basar. We give an extra word to emphasize that you always do the circumcision, even if there is a other roadblock, halachic roadblock. Professor, please, I'm sorry.
We are considering here two modes of behavior. We are either go ahead with circumcision, or we leave it alone because we decided that we cannot remove the tzara. And my question is, all right, let's assume that the second option is preferable. What happens if there is no Mila and the tzara is left? Does the child should go through all the steps of purification, wait until Kohen says that there is no tzara anymore, bring a korban, go to mikvah, wait until the sundown? What happens?
Yes.
The Gemara should have weighted those possibilities and probably reject them or somehow modify them. And this is my first question. The second question is, what if tzara is discovered on a child in a different place? Then it stays, and how does the person get rid of it? That is, I doubt that the child could go through all those steps of purification, or am I wrong?
So to the first question, which I think answers the second question, and thank you for asking it, is first of all, the assumption I believe is that if we're going to say not to do the bris, if we say that saras stops the bris because it's a stronger mitzvah, let's say, so then yeah, the child would go through, or the individual would go through the steps of purification, and then we'd revisit the question once the saras is gone. And so what our Gemara is saying is we don't even do that. We don't even go to the Kohen. We don't even give a chance for this saras to take hold. We remove it right away. Maybe even it was declared saras, but we still will not delay a bris. As far as the second question, I think I answered my impression, which is that I believe a child would undergo the steps of purification. Now, maybe it's a little too rigorous for a child on their own, so probably they would need a parent to assist in that process. And it's actually a good question. I would actually want to do more research for you to understand how a child might undergo this purification process. But I believe we are saying that a child would become ritually impure, and they probably need to have, parental. So I don't know. I don't know exactly how that would unfold. I imagine it would follow the halachic pattern. I guess the alternative would be that you'll say that a Kohen does not designate a child as a leper, but from this Gemara, it doesn't sound like that's the case. So for at least at this point, my understanding is that a child does undergo the same or similar protocols of saras. Now again, an infant, obviously, you can't leave an infant in quarantine as an adult, might be totally alone. So we have to revisit exactly how those steps might be accommodated, how we might accommodate a child in the purification process. That's a very good question, and it deserves a follow-up. So Yashikaya. But again, at this point, we have asserted that bris is more important, has priority over leprosy. Now, don't breathe a sigh of relief yet. All we've done is viewed an outline of a brisa walking through a process. I have two psukim. Maybe bris is stronger. Maybe saras is stronger. An extra word in the pasuk actually backs up, adds a weight, adds force to team bris, and now I know bris pushes aside saras. Our Gemara is now going to go down a similar path as yesterday's Gemara. Amar Rava. Rava asks the same question. Hi Tana, the brisa that we just read, who explains for us his thought process of a conflict, a contrast between bris and saras. Hi Tana, this guy, this rabbi of the brisa, why would he on one hand possibly think bris is stronger? And why in the second sentence he actually believes that maybe saras is stronger? What's going on? What is his thought process? And so now the Gemara is going to read the mind of the author of the brisa, and we're going to impose, or we're going to project, and we're going to try to psychoanalyze. That's probably not really called psychoanalyze, but we're going to try to project what his thought process is in regards to this question. We're going to try to read his mind. Doctor?
What happens if someone has sarat? It's on an area where you need surgery. So now you're going to tell me you can't do that, and it doesn't, and it's not pikuach nefesh. So you're going to tell me you can't do the surgery because there's sarat there, and you're not allowed to remove
If
the
it's
sarat?
not an emergency, what is like a
Not
schedule?
an emergency.
So first heal the saras, then you'll do your go back to
Yeah,
your.
but yeah, I understand that. But if months go by and the sarat's still there, and just it's not emergency, but by leaving it, it may lead to an emergency.
So then
So I'm assuming they'll do the removal, but
I would say then we would need you. In that scenario, I would talk to my posek, and
the posek will tell you talk to your doctor.
okay, and then the doctor and the posek will have a conference, and then they'll tell you what to do. But
Yeah.
that is a fair description of what would likely happen, as I think you may have experienced in your career when there was a halachic question that pertained to dental matters. Sorry, 1 second. All righty.
Why would the doctor go back to the posek, Rabbi? If the posek says talk to your doctor,
No, well, it depends. Sometimes the posek will say, if the doctor says you need to do it, do it. But sometimes the doctor is not going to say, yes, you need to do it. The doctor is also going to have different shikulim. And so therefore, sometimes it's helpful to have a doctor and a posek consult with each other, and then they can discuss it through, and they can come to a level-headed,
They may
responsible.
confer to discuss how to do it. For instance,
Oh.
if someone is eating and needs to eat on Yom Kippur, so there's a certain regiment of how you're supposed to eat on Yom Kippur. So it's not a flat eat on Yom Kippur, whatever.
Right,
you
it's not
want
a
to
yes
do.
or no. There are
It's
specifics.
how to do it according to halacha.
And then, so for example, I think what you're getting at is that sometimes we'll advise a person to use shiurim, to drink under the halachic volume of, but sometimes that's not enough.
Yes.
Or for certain medical conditions, you need the person to have a lot of sugary juice or a lot of carbs or whatever the specific situation is. And so, yeah, when it's not a yes or no, and it's more complex than that, it's helpful to have the experts be able to give the best halachic guidance to their client or patient.
Rabbi,
Yes, Rabbi.
Rabbi, so today, a moil comes to do a bris, would he inspect the child's body for a sore or anything, or we ignore this whole
Today
area?
tzaras is not. This is all in for the purposes of the modern day. There is no halachic conversation around tzaras. There is no leprosy. There is no Torah tzaras. There is no quarantine. There's no purification. There's no. So therefore, this whole conversation is really not applicable in
Right.
2022.
And I don't think the regular Kohen knows the difference between the different.
Today, no. Today, no.
They don't.
In the time of the Mishnah, in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, or maybe in the short time thereafter, where they were actively inspecting and administering the tzaras rituals, well then, it was known and it would be an issue.
So no one would interpret this that the moil should check the body for sores. Just
Well, even in those days, the moel doesn't inspect the body. The moel makes sure the baby is well enough to have a bris. But the moel also needs to see the site of the bris. And so if there's a leprous spot there, he would notice it. Again, today, the mohel will insist that the pediatrician signs off that the baby is able to have a bris, and the mohel will inspect the baby themselves. And not long ago, there was a family that had a baby, and I introduced them to the mohel, and the mohel inspected the baby, and the baby was somewhat premature, and the physiology of the baby was not conducive for a bris at the time. And so they consulted with the urologist, and then they actually had to wait a little bit till they did the bris. So there is, anytime that it's not, 100% straightforward, there's going to be medical consult as an essential and necessary step. Now, totally off topic, but it's a good point to be made. There are many people, especially those that are a little less from a traditional background, and bris is something new to them. I'm going to hit mute all just because there's some scratching in the background, but of course, please unmute. Some people prefer that a doctor or a urologist might do the circumcision because the urologist has a medical degree, and of course, there's a lot of training, much more training that goes into being a physician and more holistic training than being a mohel. However, and there are doctors that are mohalim and vice versa, but it should be noted that in the very narrow procedure of bris milah, circumcision, it's plausible that a mohel has many more procedures in his career than a doctor. And so it's possible that some parents who did the research would actually determine they would rather have a mohel do the procedure of circumcision, because a mohel could practically do it in their sleep, because they do it. You have mohels that do 5 brises a day. Yeah, be careful if you're in the same room as a mohel who sleepwalks. But anyway,
Rabbi, you just stated a very important medical theory from the Harvard School of Medicine. They said if you have to have surgery, look at who did it the most. Forget about the institution. Forget about the hospital.
yeah, you'd rather not have a doctor who's still in residency and getting their experience doing procedures. The good news is most patients for residents, anyways, this I hear from residents, most patients are too polite to ask and to insist, and so they'll just, but I've had residents, because we have, a number of medical doctors in residency in our young professional community, and they've advised that if you're going to go for a procedure or you're in the hospital, you might want to request that the I don't know what the term is, but the doctor might do what is it? The attending or whatever might do it, as opposed to the one of the medical students or even residents. But we love our residents and our physicians, of course. All right, let's see a little more Gemara here. So now we're going to go.
One more question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
What happens in a situation where a physician, whether Jewish or not Jewish, does the milah without a bracha? Later on, does it require a hakazas dam to become official? What happens?
So in the Jewish tradition, a child who is, and I think we did discuss this once before, but it's a very relevant question. If a person is already circumcised, or if they're born, it's kind of rare, they're born without a arla, so then there would be a hatafat dam, the slightest prick, and then they would do the ritual prayers and blessings or whatever. But, and I said this last time, there are sometimes differences between a medical routine pediatric urologist's circumcision and halachic circumcision. Halachic circumcision has specific amount of tissue that needs to be removed, and there are times where a mohel would actually advise to have an upgrade done to the circumcision. This is particularly problematic and distressful when you have a student or a person that is going through conversion, and this has happened a few times recently, where someone thought they were coasting their way to circumcision, and as a formality, they needed to be inspected by a mohel just to sign off to the bezdin that the circumcision is already present. And I've heard of, been involved in multiple scenarios where there actually had to be a circumcision upgrade because of the not all the halachic rites.
And what happens in those situations? Is mitzitza necessary?
I don't believe so. I believe then, so for example, there is a, and again, there are only a few adult mohalim in Florida. There's one mohel in particular who the Florida Bezdin suggests. His name is Rabbi Gar, and he was trained to do adult circumcision, and he has a relationship with Dr. Is it Salazar? There's a very famous, he's famous because he has some kind of TV program. He's a plastic surgeon in Bal Harbor or in Surfside, and he allows his clinic to be used on Sundays by mohalim to help facilitate brisson. Special person, and there's a special group of people that are involved in helping people who want to do that. And I think he calls himself Dr. Miami or something like that. From guy, member, I think, of the Shul Bal Harbor, and there's like a whole chevra of people that assist those who need help financially, or they want to do a bris or whatever. And there's like a wonderful group of tzaddikim that do that. But anyways, it has had to happen. But anyways, let's go back to our Gemara a little bit. Now we are reading the mind of the Tana. So if I wanted to do some false advertising on the recording of this shir, I'll call it Talmud's secret for mind reading, or how to read the mind of the Mishnah. But anyways, okay. Hachi Kamar, this is what's going on in the mind of the Tana of our Brisa, who was talking about the conflict between Taras, halachic leprosy, let's call it, and bris. Yimo b'sar lasai. The Torah says, circumcise the flesh of the arla, the foreskin. The apple pisha yesham beheres, although maybe it even has a leprous spot. Umani mekayim yishomer b'negat tzaras. How do I account for the verse that says guard tzaras? In any case, besides for if there's also a bris. If there's a bris, bris pushes aside leprosy. For some reason, I can't get it to align the way I like to, but if you just look down here, you'll see this is the translation. It applies in other places aside for circumcision. Circumcision overrides leprosy. My time, why is that? The asya mikal v'chomer. Initially, we might use logic. What logic? A 40-year inference. A kal v'chomer. Uma Shabbos chamura. Well, Shabbos is a pretty solidly strict mitzvah. It's really not good to desecrate Shabbos. The Torah is very inflexible if you ask its opinion about Shabbos. And even though Shabbos is very strong, very strict, very not malleable, not flexible under most circumstances, nonetheless, Mila Doicha Isa, as strong as Shabbos is, circumcision delivers a knockout punch. Shabbos cannot stand in a fight against circumcision because circumcision is so much stronger, more powerful. It pushes aside Shabbos. Saras, or leprosy, like kol shekain, of course, circumcision is going to push aside Saras. Mila, circumcision is so strong it even pushes away Shabbos. Shabbos is strong. Shabbos is important. Shabbos is a high priority mitzvah. Leprosy is not as important, not as powerful. So for sure, Mila should push aside Saras. This is his initial take on the matter. Let's take a glimpse in the wording of Rabbi Steinsaltz. Maybe he uses less bombastic language than I just did. All the more so, circumcision overrides leprosy, which is less stringent than Shabbos. This is the initial take of the Brisa. The Tana says, but of course, if I have two psukim and I don't know which is stronger, with logic alone, I can infer that Shabbos is stronger with the Kal V'chomer. That's his first possible take. Then the Brisa continues, Oy einai, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe leprosy is stronger. Oy einai dekamar, can you explain to me why now the author of the Brisa supposes maybe Saras is stronger? Here's what he was thinking. Hadar Kamar. He went back and said as follows. Shabbos chamira. Who asserted that Shabbos is more chamor than Saras? That was our assumption, but maybe that assumption was wrong. We need to challenge our assumptions. Dilma Saras chamira. Maybe in truth, leprosy is a stronger force to be reckoned with halachically than Shabbos. You know why? When there is Saras, Rabbi, you're muted. Are you saying something?
No, it's fine. I'm just. I do have a klutz kasha, but
Here,
I'll
so
leave
give me
it
one
for the
second.
end.
Then I just want to.
I'll leave it for the end.
Yeah, okay. Maybe Saras is stronger. In other words, what's really happening here is, of course, from one angle, Shabbos is stronger. From another angle, Saras is stronger. The initial reading, we assume Shabbos is stronger because that's our sense. But if you look a little deeper, maybe Saras is chamira. Why? Saras blocks a kohen from serving the Beis Hamikdash. So what's stronger, Saras versus serving the Beis Hamikdash? Saras. And avoida pushes aside Shabbos. So if I could bully you, or no, I should say, if you could. Now we have to create a series of hierarchies. What's stronger, Avoida or Shabbos? Avoida stronger. What's stronger, Tsaras or Avoida? Tsaras. So if Tsaras is stronger than Avoida and Avoida is stronger than Shabbos, Tsaras is stronger than Shabbos. And therefore, it's probably even stronger than Mila too. Basically, again, we're trying to determine a hierarchy of halachic strength, halachic force, halachic stringency. And so maybe Tsaras is on top of the food chain because Tsaras pushes aside Avoida, Tsaras should push aside Mila. We probably should. All right, I'm not going to draw any diagrams now, but maybe we could find a diagram that lays out these series. So, but anyways, long story short, there's an angle that says Tsaras is more strict. There's an angle that says Mila is more strict. It has to do with our sense of a hierarchy of Chumrah. They both counteract each other. The two ways of understanding it. So we have two psukim that are at a standstill. We try to use logic to give strength to one verse over the other, but there are two ways of understanding it. Each rationalization counterweighs or outweighs the other, neutralizing each other, bringing us back to a question mark. Which one is stronger? Talmud Loimar Basar, and that's where the word Basar is introduced. It's an added word to give an added punch to tell us that Saras is stronger. Saras pushes aside. I'm sorry, Mila is stronger, pushing aside Saras. So again, two psukim come into a clash. They're both stuck. They're at a standstill. We don't know which one's stronger. We have two ways of probing rationally which one is stronger, Saras or Mila. The only way to resolve this is with another word in the Torah, and that's the word Basar. This is the thought process of the Tana in the Brisa, telling us, I'm not sure if it's this way or that way. Talmud Loimar Basar. The word Basar tells us bris is stronger. Alan, I'm sorry, you had your hand raised on it. If you'll unmute yourself, go ahead.
There's one thing that overrides that. It's
Go ahead.
jaundice. If the baby is jaundiced, they might hesitate.
No. We're not going to, well, actually not, no. Yes. In other words, reframe your statement. The one thing that pushes aside Mila is
Jaundice.
not on this, pikuach nefesh. Jeopardy of life. Jeopardy of life pushes aside all the mitzvahs that we're talking about now. And that's the reason why circumcision is deferred in an instance where a person has a medical condition that makes the bris not feasible. Now, Alan, we're getting some feedback from your mic. So let me just hit mute. Yeah, but unmute for further comments and questions. Thank you. So again, I know we're going slow. I want to make sure that we're clear with this more. Tana tells us he has a thought process, and we put words into the thought process. Pasuk, no resolution. Logic, we're at a standstill. Add a word in the Torah, and that resolves and adds a weight, the team Mila, and therefore, this is the explanation of the rabbi in the Brisa, who says that circumcision pushes aside Mila. The extra word gives weight to the pasuk, which tells us that Mila takes precedent. Lishna Achrina. There is actually another interpretation. There's another way of understanding the Brisa. And that's what the Gemara is going to do now. Let me go through this. Let's go through this a little faster because it's going to be a similar formula using maybe a little bit of different explanations. Let's see. Mila doiches hatzaras. Circumcision has priority. My time or why? How do I know? The asi asay v'dachi lois asay. Generally speaking, what is stronger, a positive commandment or a negative commandment? So generally speaking, if Hashem gives a positive commandment, it would push aside a negative commandment. The instance that I'll share with you, I don't want to think of a good, easy example where we push aside a negative prohibition if the Torah proactively tells you to do a mitzvah that seems to be in conflict. I'll tell you.
I say bris milah, but
yeah, but bris milah is the medubar. So give me another instance. Give me an external.
Well, doing the avodah.
Doing the avodah on Shabbos, okay. You know that tzitzis, generally, speaking, a person is not allowed to wear wool and linen.
Tzitzis can be shatnez, yeah.
Tzitzis could be shatnez. We don't wear tzitzis at a shatnez, but tzitzis could be shatnez. The big day kahuna, the Kohen's clothing, has wool and linen. Generally speaking, a Jew is not allowed to wear wool and linen. There is a negative prohibition, but there is a positive mitzvah that tells us here is how you wear, here is how you design the Kohen's clothing. And so generally speaking, we say that an asay pushes aside a doi, loi, sa. So now the Gemara says, you know why the Brisa initially opens up saying, I think bris is stronger? Because bris is a positive commandment. Remove the arla. Saras is a negative commandment. Guard saras. Don't let someone remove it. Which one should be stronger? Out of the gate, we assume Mila is stronger. That's the case to be made for bris to overpower saras. So why then does the Brisa, the author of the Brisa, see maybe another way? Hadar Kamar, he goes on and says, you know what? Amar Damrinon, maybe when do we say that Asay Dachi Loisase? Only if it's Loisase Gredai, single, lonesome, negative commandment. But Saras is not just a negative commandment. Hi, Asay Viloisasehu. Leprosy has a positive commandment and a negative commandment. Where do we see a positive and negative commandment? Rashi rides to our rescue. It says Hishomer, and that's a loitasa. And then it says, Lasas kechol asher yeru, do whatever the kohen, whatever you're instructed. That's a positive commandment. So being a leprosy has a positive and negative commandment. Maybe it has enough strength to negate the power of the positive commandment. So again, the sage of the Brisa maybe says out of the gate, I think bris is stronger. It's a positive commandment. But wait, Saras also has a positive angle. There's a proactive and a negative. So therefore, Mani Mekayim, Mimal Basar Lasai. Maybe I'll say, you know what? You have to do a circumcision only Bisman Shein Bo Beheres. Maybe you could only do a bris when there's no leprosy. Talmud Loimar. Therefore, the Torah adds the word Basar. Afal Pi Sheyesh Boy Shom Beheres. In other words, I think the way we would explain it is like this: the word Basar is like all flesh. I don't care what's on the flesh. Get rid of it. Give me one moment. Sorry about that. So this is a second read, a second take on the Brisa. All right. Now, the Gemara continues to ask a question that reflects something that I may have made a mistake about earlier, but let's see. Teinach Gadol. When it comes to an adult, meaning when it comes to a person that could be experience consequences, the word basar applies. And the word basar is what tells us that you cut any kind of arla. Katanami kseve basar. In the context of a child, it also uses the word basar. But what about someone that's somewhere between 8 days or 9 days old and bar mitzvah? Let's read Rashi. Teinach gadol bar oinshim, a person who receives punishment. Basar v'arla. It says a person who doesn't circumcise experiences consequences. Consequences can only apply to someone over bar mitzvah. It says basar v'arla zachar asher lo yimos basar lasa. A person that doesn't circumcise himself. We use the word basar. The word basar tells us that we push aside saras to do a circumcision. This verse is talking about an adult. Also, an 8-day-old baby, it says, so we have two psukim that talk about a timely bris and an adult bris. But Beinoni, what about the middle kind of child from 9 days old until bar mitzvah? A child who's already missed the deadline. He's past 8 days, but he's not a bar onshim. He doesn't get punishment because he's on the bar mitzvah. The aviv mitzvah love, who carries the obligation? His father. How do I know that? Nafkala mihimo lechem kol basar. So what about this child? Does he also get a bris on Shabbos? I'm sorry. A child that's after 8 days and under bar mitzvah and he has saras, do we circumcise or not? That's the Gemara's question. Amar Abaya Asyami Beinaya. We look at this middle child as a sandwich. Migodolai Asya. He is not like an adult. Shekin Anish Karis. An adult gets Karis. Mikoton loy Asya. He's not like a baby. Shekin Mila Bismana. It's a timely bris. Hatzad Ashava Shebehem, but there is something in common. Shekin Mimoilin V'Deichen Esatzaras. These two both push aside saras. Av kol shani moilim. We can now infer that everything that's in the middle of the sandwich, deichen es saras. They also push aside saras. So again, this is another type of Talmudic formula. You get this a little bit in the Babas. For those that learned, I think Baba Kama, Baba, you see this formula. Tzad Hashava, right?
Let's see it.
Right? Remember that? Talk about Nezikin, and sometimes we use the logic of one and the other. So here too, although there is no explicit reference in the Torah to basar, and so maybe the Beinoni child, the interim sort of child, 9 days old to bar mitzvah, doesn't get a bris if there's leprosy, because there's a sandwich on both sides, and they both, although they're very different from one another, you push aside tzaras, we can therefore, using this Talmudic style or Mishnah style logic, we can also give a bris, even if there's leprosy, to the 9-day-old baby till bar mitzvah. That's yeah. This is how we know that bris pushes aside leprosy for any person. Basar, and sandwich, a basar sandwich. Pardon me for that. All right. Let's do just a few short more lines. A question that we've been thinking all along. Rava says, a different way of understanding this. We're going to take a peek now and we'll continue next week. And just by the way, in case you're getting a little bit tired of this, we are towards the end of this mode of discussion. Not entirely done, but we're getting towards the Rava says like this. Mila bizmana doicha, light tzricha. I needed a pasuk to tell me that a timely bris pushes aside leprosy. Mikal v'chaymer asya, I can use logic, and this is going to be familiar logic because this is logic that we already deployed just before. Ma Shabbos the chamir doicha, just as Shabbos is so strict, it pushes aside a bris. So ras like kol shekin, of course, leprosy, which is more lenient, it should push aside leprosy. Rashi explains, what's the advantage of Rava's attempt here? If you don't need the word basar to tell me that a timely bris pushes aside Shabbos, we'll borrow that word basar to tell us that a late bris is also pushes aside leprosy. And so then we won't need the sadashava, well, anyways, Amar le Rav Safra le Rava. Rav Safra challenges Rava, just as our Gemara challenged the same logic previously. This is again a familiar thought process. Shabbos Chamira, why are you so certain that Shabbos is stricter than Tzaras? Dilma Tzaras Chamira, maybe Tzaras is the stronger, stricter one. Shekain doiches avoda, Tzaras would knock a person off of serving in the Beis Hamikdash. Avoda doiches Shabbos, and avoda, which is overpowered by Tzaras, pushes aside Shabbos, and therefore probably Tzaras is higher on the food chain. Tzaras is higher than Avoida, Avoida is higher than Shabbos, and therefore Tzaras is higher than Shabbos. You know what this Gemara makes me think of? You know the pictures of the staircase, and you can't figure out if it's, you know what I'm talking about? There's like an optical illusion where you can't tell if the orientation of the image is whatever. So basically, we're not sure. Is Avoida on top of Shabbos? Is Shabbos on top of Avoida? Depends on the perspective, the logical perspective. But anyways, Rav Safra says, hold on, I think Tzaras is stronger. Rava now is going to deflect this assertion. Hassam, do you know why a person that has Tzaras can't do Avoida? It's not because Tzaras is stronger than Avoida. Hassam lab mishum de chamira Tzaras. It's not because of the stringency of Tzaras. El mishum de gavrahu de lechazi. The Avoida is not canceled. The kohen is canceled. The kohen has to go heal himself. The kohen is not fit for Avoida because he's impure. But it's not that essentially Tzaras pushes aside Avoida. Amai, the Gemara says, how do you know this? Yaketz barasai vayavoid. Then he should just cut off the Tzaras. He still needs to go to mikvah. So therefore, there's a technicality that doesn't allow a leper to serve in the Beis Hamikdash, but it's not to say that in the essential hierarchy of chumrah, of stringency, Tzaras is on top of the food chain. Let's stop right over here. So again, tomorrow, on Monday, the Ezra Hashem, when we regroup, when we re-meet, we'll start off with the question of, can we use logic to prove that a 8-day-old baby doesn't need to wait for the healing of leprosy, which is the professor's preferred way of seeing it, and Rabbi Allen and the Gemara.
Rabbi,
So we'll see.
I have a klutz kasha, but maybe after you stop
Well,
recording.
go ahead. So let's with this, let's formally close out our Friday session of studying the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Thank you all for joining us. We should have only good news, healthy news, happy news. And now, of course, we'll give another minute or two for closing klutz kashas, closing comments, and the like. Excuse me. Rebbe, go ahead.
What do we do today with someone who is Jewish, who never had a bris? The parents didn't want him to have a bris, and he doesn't also. What are the consequences to him?
Well, we're not going to kidnap him and circumcise him against his will.
Does he have any restrictions in anything?
You want to know? That's a very interesting question. What you're asking is, are there any social consequences in 2022 for an uncircumcised Jew?
Not social, halachic.
Halachic. Give me what's the academic word? Socio-halachic? Because there are no, meaning, are there communal limitations that society, that halacha places on a person? Is a person barred from any communal experience? I don't think so. I don't think so. There may have been kihilot that would make their own restrictions, saying, hey, if there was a proliferation
Even
of
for
people,
Pesach? For Pesach?
no, Karban
for
Pesach, yeah. In the time of the Beis Hamikdash, a person would not be able to do Karban Pesach. I think Rebbe was asking in the modern world. In oral, I don't think it's allowed.
Eating, participation in Seder.
So in temple times, there would be, in the time of the Karban Pesach, an oral cannot have a Karban Pesach. They cannot participate. It's possible that they're not allowed into the temple plaza. Also, when a person who's uncircumcised, I think when they pass on, if they are uncircumcised, it's possible that the Chevra Kedisha would remove the foreskin before burying them. Or God forbid, a baby who passes before being circumcised, the Chevra Kedisha would circumcise the baby. There may be other halachic considerations, but there are not universal. There's no universal. There's not a universal denial of societal socio-halachic perks for not being circumcised.
So during Tahara, this is checked.
For sure by babies. I don't know by adults, but it's I'm a Kohen, so I'm very removed from the technical aspects of Tahara, but that may be so. There probably need to be a family consent before any kind of, but that may be so. I'm not certain. That may be so. Certainly a baby that's unfortunately passes before having a bris, which it could happen, especially, babies that are born not well. They are circumcised and given a Jewish name before they're buried. But again, I wouldn't be surprised. I haven't done the research. I wouldn't be surprised if throughout the ages, different communities created certain restrictions for uncircumcised people. I would especially not be surprised if it was done in the aftermath of large waves of conversion, let's say in Christian, let's say but especially in Spain, Spanish and Portugal. I wouldn't be surprised if the communities that remained, that left in Turkey or in whatever, or Greece or Israel, may have placed additional restrictions for uncircumcised people.
No, you have it today with Soviet Jewry.
But there's efforts to do outreach and to encourage, but there's no ostracization.
I think if I'm not mistaken, the Rambam is quite lenient when it comes to
famously
like
the
that.
sages who actually dealt with persecution, so it wasn't academic, tend to be more lenient and accommodating, whereas those who did not actually deal with it tend to be more strict. And you can kind of, there are different debates in the Rishonim, but generally speaking, and it's actually a general theory, I think, about Tosfos. If you look at Tosfos in general, when it comes to matters of persecution, avodah zarah, and he tends to have a very Tosfos has many authors, but generally there's a more understanding and sympathetic sentiment in the halachic.
The Rambam has a fantastic phrase where he says, if you don't, you lose all the generations
Correct.
that follow.
The Rambam has a famous work called Igeret Hashmad, and there's another Igeret Teiman where he communicates to communities that were undergoing terrible persecution, and he calls for compassion and for assisting and allowing people to return. And there were communities that did ostracize conversos, and you can understand where that happened. Let's say after the Spanish expulsion, you had Jews who converted and stayed, and this is not a judgment, of course, for them. And then you have Jews that lost everything and left and had family members that died as a result of the process. You could imagine there would have been hard feelings between those who left and those who stayed, or those that suffered and those that were able to thrive and hold on to their wealth. And there is a degree of, and there's a lot of research on this. I'm not well read on this, but there was a good bit of discrimination between the converso community and the original community. If I'm not mistaken, the title Sit, or last name, or Samachtes, stands for Sfaradi Tahar, a pure Sephardic Jew. But I don't believe it's talking about as so much as opposed to Ashkenaz, but it's talking, I think, more about that they never left. I think they never rejected Jewish faith. I may be wrong, but I believe that is the case.
In Mallorca today, I just read an article recently. There is a group of about a dozen or 15 families with specific last names that it is known that they're descendants of the conversos, and they only intermarry between themselves, and they are ostracized by the rest of the general population because of their being descendants of conversos. And now there's an effort to try to bring them into the fold permanently. The
You
same
don't have to
issue-
go that far. You have New Mexico.
Yeah,
You have
yeah,
New Mexico
yes,
similar.
you do.
But those
They're in
people have a
Portugal.
less pure, less of a preserved identity. They talk about heritage, whereas I think Dr. Stamler is describing a group that have pretty much held on and been discriminated as a result of this preservation to whatever extent. And there are other places in Portugal, I think, that you have like little shtetls that also have, very interesting
Right.
stories of preserving Jewish identity and intermarriage and mezuzah and certain mitzvahs. I don't remember the name of the city, but there's a famous mountain community that I believe it's in Portugal as well.
Yeah.
So this is fascinating.
The same question comes up today, really, in modern Judaism with intermarriage.
Yeah.
How, do we want to lose? Do we don't want to lose? And that's a big issue with reform and conservative and.
Yeah.
All right.
Gentlemen, have a wonderful Shabbos. Thank you all. And thank you for
good
the
Shabbos.
interesting.
Enjoy the
Shalom.
weekend.
Look forward to
By the
seeing
way-
everybody. Oh, hold on. I want to add one
Sure.
thing, Dr. Hammer, and then I want to tell you one other nice thing. Go ahead, Dr. Hammer.
The Portuguese one that's famous up north is Belmonte, because the Israeli government recognized them as Jews in 1974. There were like 200 families, and it's a shul, and I've spent a Shabbos there,
Oh, wow.
and it's amazing. And they follow everything. Everybody comes to shul, children, women, from starting with Friday till Havdalah. The place is packed. They only get a rabbi every second week sent from Israel. There's one store that's food for whatever.
Fascinating.
Fascinating place to go.
Give me 10 seconds. I want to show you something very nice. We had in our shul like 30 years ago or 20, when I was a kid, there was a Holocaust survivor called Blanche Fish who donated a Torah. She saved up money. She was a very unassuming, righteous person. Whenever they would visit her, and whenever we would visit her, she was sitting and saying Tillim. She would schlep people to shul, and she was not a well-to-do person. She lived in one of the more humble building apartments.
Like Lemaire.
Not like Lemaire, no. She lived probably in like the Imperial or in the Plaza Towers. Not terrible, but I'm just saying more modest presentation. And she approached my father at some point and said, listen, I've been saving up this money. I really, really want to buy a Torah for the shul to honor my family and my relatives who were perished in the Shoah. And so they got a Torah. It was actually a pre-war used Torah that had been, I guess, preserved, and they fixed it up and they donated it to the shul. And for many, 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 many years, that was the only Torah that our shul had. And so for many, many years, if there was 3 Torahs, there was one Torah that was rolled to 3 places. And it got a lot of use. And with time, it started fading. And, people lent. There was another Torah that was lent. And then we wrote our Torah, that was to honor my mother. And that Torah actually had a number of red flags. And so we had to shelve it. And my father, for actually many years, was already, before we got to the Torahs, was concerned about it. And I had a sofer inspected, and they did a scan, and they found a number. Almost every column had a letter that was faded or cracked. And the Torah was essentially pasul. It was out of commission. And generally speaking, it's not cheap to fix Torahs, and wouldn't necessarily fix the Torah, except this Torah has a very special sentimental value, but also, I don't even want to use the word sentiment. We're talking about a woman who survived the Holocaust and dedicated a Torah to honor her family. And so for a few weeks in Shul, I announced that we have this Torah, we want to fix it. And a doctor, a new member of the community that's been coming here, heard the announcement and called me up and said, Rabbi, I want to get involved. And so I new person, I wasn't going to, but he basically paid the full cost of refurbishing the Torah. Actually, we did receive a few other donations, but he gave the remainder. And we had the Torah fixed. And they told me it would arrive right before Rosh Hashanah, but Baruch Hashem, this week, we received the Torah back. And so this Torah that's pre-war and was purchased and dedicated by a survivor to honor her family, and was seemingly going to be lost forever from circulation and use, is going to be read for the first time since that repair the Shabbos. And to me, it's very symbolic of the story of Elul and the rebirth and the, Teshuvah, where something that seems to be forgotten or lost. We're talking about Maranos or villages that are lost forever. And so we have a beautiful symbolism of the fact that a Jew is never lost forever, and a Torah can be brought back, and the memory of those who perished and the memory of those who are no longer with us live on. And I think it's a very special and beautiful, and to me, a very moving celebration. I actually asked the family, I said, listen, the Torah just arrived. We have two choices. We could hold off on reading it and make a celebration, or we could read it right away. So I said, no, we got to read it right away, and we'll mark the moment, and then we can have a kiddush or something to celebrate later on. So that's happening this Shabbos. So anyways, wanted to share that nice development, and I wish everyone a wonderful Shabbos, an uplifting Shabbos, and we should only have good, healthy, happy, nachas-filled news. Shabbos.
Good Shabbos.